Warmest greetings from South Wales in the United Kingdom. My name's Stillman and I'm International President of God Squad. And welcome to this weekly reflection which different ones of us within the leadership bring from the Gospels. And this week we're looking at a passage from Matthew chapter 7. Now, many years ago in my early years of ministry, I was given some advice, and that was to check out those who you would see as your mentors, those people who would be influencing you. Check out those authors, those preachers, all those voices of influence. And if you get a chance and an opportunity, take a look in their eyes. What do you see? Look at their lifestyle, look at their behaviour, and ask yourself, do they actually practice what they preach? And as I look back, that was good advice, and it served me well. And today we're surrounded by many different voices, particularly through social media. Endless scrolling through the screen will give us endless different opinions, and it can feel like, a bit like a free all-you-can-eat unregulated buffet in some food hall somewhere. And we gorge ourselves, and some of it's good, and quite frankly, some of it is not so good. But how do we know what and who is good for us? How do we know who's the real deal? Whose opinions can we trust? Indeed, why should I actually sit here and make the assumption that my voice in all your scrolling today is worth listening to and is indeed safe to listen to? But these challenges aren't actually new, and they existed long before social media. And in the scriptures we find in the Old Testament, there's a long history of calling false teachers to account. They're often shown up by their inaccuracies and their advocating of other gods, and their own poor behaviour would eventually catch up with them. And Jesus also expected there would be those who would disguise themselves as fellow travellers, but who were actually ravenous wolves. They didn't have our best interests at heart. And the Apostle Paul, well, he knew that similar people would have an influence on the early church as it began to grow. And Jesus issued a warning with some very practical advice as to why we can't always take people at face value, especially if they claim to speak for God. So I'm going to read Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 to 20, and it's within the context of something called the Sermon on the Mount. It's at the end of 3 chapters in Matthew, where Jesus in his teaching was seeking to demonstrate you can't actually separate what you believe to how you live. And in that particular context, it certainly offered an alternative to the violence of Rome, and it also offered an alternative to religion that was simply seen as lip service. It offered the radical road of discipleship in following Jesus. But this is what he says, it's recorded in Matthew 7 from verse 15. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ferocious wolves. And it's by their fruit you'll recognise them. Do you pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. And a good tree can't bear bad fruit, and a bad tree can't bear good fruit. And every tree that doesn't bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognise them. So just a couple of points from those verses. Jesus knew that impostors would eventually come to infiltrate the community of disciples and the church as it grew. But they wouldn't necessarily be that obvious at first. They'd look like everyone else. They'd use the same words, and many of them would have the same ideas. And after all, a bad influence isn't necessarily going to advertise themselves as such. But eventually, they will be shown up for who they are. And sometimes it takes time for the full extent of their dodgy fruit to emerge, sometimes after the damage is done. But we should still be wise and be asking of those whose influence we sit under, what lies under this fleece, a wolf or a sheep? And Jesus uses a simple picture to explain his concern. That of fruit, the product of a tree's growth, and what forms its identity. Now, who we really are and what we believe shows up in the fruit of our lives. Who we really are and what we believe shows up in how leaders lead. Who we really are and what we believe shows up in how our leaders are prepared to be accountable. Who we really are and what we believe shows up in how our leaders use their money, their time, and their resources. And who we really are and what we believe shows up in the small things, like how we speak of others when they aren't listening. Is what is said in the public space supported by a pattern of behaviour that reflects the Jesus teaching of the Beatitudes, for example? Do we see a desire for poverty of spirit? Do we see genuine lament, meekness, humility, a desire for a pure heart? Do we see a thirst for a truly righteous life, a commitment to mercy and the pursuit of peace? Do we see the person who seeks to influence us as someone that will endure persecution for the cause of Christ? These Beatitudes are signs of what it is to want to live truthfully. And where a community wants to live like this, it will more likely sniff out a false prophet and a dodgy teacher. It won't tolerate the inconsistencies between what is said and what is done. I want to go back to the beginning of this reflection where I talked about the advice that I received on checking people out. And one of those people who started to influence me and who I checked out, and I had the pleasure of his company, and who I found to be genuinely authentic in his life of following Jesus, was a guy called Eugene Peterson, a wonderfully meek man. And this is his paraphrased translation of this passage in Matthew 7, recorded in the Message translation of the Bible. And he wrote this: "Be wary of false preachers who smile a lot, dripping with practiced sincerity. Chances are they're out to rip you off one way or other. Don't be impressed with charisma. Look for character. Who preachers are is the main thing, not what they say. A genuine leader will never exploit your emotions or your pocketbook. These diseased trees with their bad apples are going to be chopped down and burned." So there's some pretty strong words of advice and warning there. So as we scroll through our screens, as we absorb so much influence and opinion of others, I want to encourage you to look to be impressed by character as well as words. After all, righteous words and righteous thinking should produce righteous behaviour. And fruit takes time to grow. It can't be rushed. But also in the same way, the effect of poor behaviour is not always seen quickly. It emerges in patterns of bitter divisions, upsets, and ungodly behaviour over time. And a word for those of us who would be leaders, or for those of us that would see ourselves as leaders. Behaviour matters. How you behave in private matters. Practicing what you preach is still a test for the genuine fruit of discipleship in Christ. And in the meantime, beware of those who would suggest otherwise. So travel well and travel wisely. Cheers. God bless.